In week 4 of the Joshlin Smith trial, the story shifted from speculation to state structure, from witness memory to police procedure, and at the center of it all stood Captain Wesley Lombard, a seasoned investigator from the Western Cape's Organized Crime and Kidnapping Unit, and the first witness in what the court would define as a trial within a trial. This phase wasn't about what happened to Joshlin. It was about what happened to the people accused of taking her. The court now had to determine, were the statements given by Jacquen Appollis and Steveno van Rhyn made freely, and could they be used against them? Before we dive in, I just wanted to send a personal thank you to new members of our channel. Thank you for subscribing. For us, a self-funded media publication, this means a lot. Also, I wanted to give out personal shout-outs to those who've commented on our Joshlin Smith trial weekly deep dives. Thank you for the comments. Not only does it create conversation around the subject of the video, but it also helps us reach new viewers. Okay, back to the breakdown. Captain Wesley Lombard entered the Joshlin Smith investigation not as a lead detective but as a specialized resource, one brought in precisely because of what the case had become. By the time he was called in, Joshlin had already been missing for several days. The community in Saldanha Bay was deeply unsettled. Media coverage had intensified. Politicians were weighing in. The public was watching, and the pressure on SAPS was mounting. Lombard, a senior officer in the Western Cape's Organized Crime and Kidnapping Task Team, was deployed to assist the investigation. His task was not to take over, but to apply specialized oversight. He would track the movement of persons of interest, assist with the analysis of intelligence gathered from informants, oversee the interview process, and ensure that suspect interactions complied with procedural standards. He worked alongside Sergeant Mayor Milstein, who remained the designated investigating officer, but Lombard's role quickly expanded because what began as a missing persons case was, by early March, beginning to resemble a coordinated crime, potentially involving drug networks, informants, and child trafficking leads. Lombard described his duties as quote-unquote operational coordination, but what that actually meant became clearer through his testimony. He was the officer who identified emerging suspects based on shifting witness accounts, tracked inconsistencies in timelines between statements, ran down intel from the street using confidential sources to establish context, habits, and links between those under investigation, and eventually helped orchestrate the operation on the 4th of March 2024 that brought in Kelly Smith, Jacquen Appollis, and Steveno van Rhyn for intensive questioning at the Sea Border Unit compound. It was also Lombard who pieced together how the accused were funding their tick use. That meant going deeper, looking at not just what happened to Joshlin, but at the social and economic networks around those implicated. By the time the 4th of March arrived and the decision was taken to bring the suspects in for questioning, Lombard wasn't just a peripheral support figure. He'd become a central logistical force in the operational side of the investigation, tasked with ensuring that the interrogation process unfolded legally, securely, and with oversight. What he saw on those days and what he would later say in court would help shape not just the trial but the question of whether the state's evidence was built on solid ground. Captain Lombard's earliest interactions with Kelly Smith were not just observational, they were investigatory. He wasn't only assessing her behavior as a mother of a missing child, he was also tasked with understanding how the suspects in the case, Kelly, Jacquen, and Steveno, were sustaining their drug habits, particularly their use of tick. To answer that, Lombard turned to his informant network. He told the court that while gathering background intelligence, confidential sources, individuals familiar with Saldanha Bay's underworld, revealed that Kelly Smith was involved in prostitution. These weren't just vague accusations. Two separate informants, according to Lombard, had worked alongside her and were familiar with her routine and associations. It was the first time in court that this aspect of Kelly's life was publicly disclosed. Both informants, according to Lombard, knew Kelly personally and had worked with her and confirmed that she earned money through sex work and that this income supported her drug habits. It also became clear that Jacquen was aware of this. This wasn't presented as mere character evidence. It was part of a broader investigative thread. How were the suspects funding their tick use and what environments were they operating in? Lombard made no moral commentary. He simply relayed what had come up in the course of his fieldwork. This revelation, though, added new texture to his earlier testimony about Kelly's behavior. When he first encountered her after Joshlin's disappearance, she didn't cry, she didn't ask questions, and often showed no signs of panic or desperation. She answered questions briefly, provided little additional detail, and did not ask for updates about her daughter's case. Lombard also described how she behaved on the 4th of March when she was brought in for questioning alongside Jacquen and Steveno. He said Kelly sat quietly in the boardroom at Seaborder. She didn't demand to know what was happening. She didn't ask to call anyone. She didn't ask about Joshlin. She was, in his words, passive. What Lombard observed and what his investigation uncovered painted a portrait of a woman who was not outwardly alarmed by the disappearance of a child. Instead, she presented as withdrawn, emotionally flat, and when seen through the lens of Lombard's intel, deeply entangled in the environment the investigators were now tracing. The decision to detain Kelly Smith, Jacquen Appollis, and Steveno van Rhyn for questioning on Monday, the 4th of March 2024, was not made in a vacuum. It came at the end of a tense, chaotic weekend of fieldwork, political oversight, community upheaval, and critical intelligence findings that reshaped the direction of the investigation. Captain Lombard's testimony detailed a turning point that began as early as Friday, the 1st of March, when he and other senior officers returned to Saldanha Bay. That morning, a high-level meeting was held at the Multipurpose Center, attended by operational and non-detective members. There, Sergeant Milstein shared classified elements of the investigation, carefully restricting what could be revealed to protect the sensitivity of the case. By that stage, it was clear to the police that the people at the center of the case, Kelly, Jacquen, Steveno, Lourentia, and Ayanda, were not all telling the truth. Their accounts of what happened on the 19th of February 2024, the day Joshlin disappeared, were inconsistent and contradictory. Officers already knew from statements that Steveno and Lourentia had been present at the house that day, but it was unclear what roles each of them had played. That Friday afternoon, the police received word that Provincial MEC Rhyn Allen would be visiting Saldanha Bay. He wanted to speak to the suspects directly. That's when it was discovered that Kelly, Jacquen, Lourentia Ayanda, and their children were staying at separate resorts in Langebaan. Lombard said he didn't know who financed those stays initially, but later learned the municipality covered the cost for safety reasons following a vigilante attack on Ayanda and Lourentia in late February. Later that day, they also received notice that former police minister Bekicele would arrive the following morning, Saturday the 2nd of March. Police were ordered to prepare a presentation, and by that evening, senior officers had gathered to draft their report. Lombard left for Cape Town that night. The next morning, Lombard returned to Saldanha. He arrived to find rising tensions in the community. Police presence was high. Ella had arrived and engaged in an oversight tour of Diazville, meeting with residents and attending briefings. Lombard shared a striking moment. Before the minister's arrival, Kelly Smith approached him outside, dressed in a dark green dress with her hair blown out. After paying her an innocent compliment, she smiled and said, open quote, "Sir, I'm famous. Joshlin made me famous," close quote. He found her comment and demeanor unnerving, calm, almost pleased, with no indication of distress or grief. Meanwhile, community members were growing hostile. Social media quote-unquote investigators were outpacing the SAPs in influence. TikTok videos had fueled rumors that the police had stopped searching for Joshlin, an allegation Lombard strongly denied. The team was still actively searching, but morale was sinking. Then came what should have been a major break. Bloody children's clothing was discovered on the other side of Ayanda's car wash, far from the original crime scene on Sunday, the 3rd of March 2024. Police mobilized immediately. A forensic team processed the site, and a search perimeter was established, stretching from the discovery point through surrounding properties, including Ayanda's car wash. But the search yielded nothing. No body, no new clues, no confirmation that the blood belonged to Joshlin. Still, the search team had now ballooned to 330 members across 20 tactical groups, assisted by drones and specialized units. The focal point remained Diazville, and still, they found nothing. By Monday morning, the 4th of March 2024, the team regrouped at the center where the makeshift court would later be hosted. After a final debrief, the decision was made. Bring in Kelly, Jacquen, and Steveno. Lourentia Lombaard was not in the area at the time. She was reportedly en route to Cape Town with Ayanda and their kids, but the 3 others were accessible. On that Monday afternoon, the Seaborder Unit compound in Saldanha Bay became the staging ground for what would later trigger a legal dispute at the heart of the trial: the admissibility of 2 statements allegedly made by Jacquen Appollis and Steveno van Rhyn. Captain Lombard arrived at the compound at approximately 4:30 p.m. By that time, all three suspects, Kelly, Jacquen and Steveno, had already been transported to the premises, each brought in by different officers at staggered times throughout the day. Lombard made it clear in his testimony the three were not under arrest at this point. They were being detained for questioning as part of an intelligence gathering operation. Their rights had not yet been formally read. They had not been charged, but they were being kept apart, placed in different boardrooms within the FCS section of the facility. This sequence of events, spanning from Friday the 1st of March to Monday the 4th of March, marked the tightening of the noose in the state's investigation. It was no longer about public pressure. It was no longer about social media storms. It was now about confronting the central figures, isolating their accounts, and seeing if the truth finally would surface. The interrogations that followed and the statements that emerged would trigger formal charges and the trial within a trial that is still unfolding in court. The defense for Jacquen and Steveno during cross-examination zoned in on the alleged torture their clients endured and unlawful procedures authorities undertook to force statements out of their clients, which they once dismissed. Lombard, a senior coordinator on site, testified that he moved between rooms and was present for parts of the interactions involving the suspects. He said he observed no signs of assault, threats, or intimidation. At no point, he claimed, did he see a suspect being coerced. When he entered the room where Jacquen Appollis was being held, Lombard noted that Jacquen had a visible blue eye. When asked about it, Jacquen allegedly said he was not assaulted. Lombard recalled that Jacquen claimed he had bumped into something or sustained the injury earlier. Lombard accepted this at face value and did not escalate the matter. Lombard described Steveno van Rhyn as visibly nervous but not physically harmed. He said Steveno was cooperative and did not raise any allegations of mistreatment. At the time, Lombard had no reason to suspect that anything untoward had taken place. Kelly Smith, meanwhile, was waiting quietly in one of the rooms. Lombard saw her smoking outside at the facility at some point. He described her as calm, passive, and emotionally disengaged. She did not demand answers. She did not ask to see anyone, and notably, she did not ask about her missing daughter. Instead, she asked only whether she could see Jacquen, a request Lombard denied. During this time, Lombard was told by a brigadier that a civilian, identified only as Owen in court records, was outside and had information. Lombard interviewed Owen, who claimed to have known Kelly since 2019. He said at the time he did general work and helped around the house of a man from the Navy. The man often left for weeks and months on end, leaving his house abandoned. Owen told Lombard that to gain entry into the property to do his work sometimes, a neighbor was always available to open up for him. On one occasion in 2019, the man had allegedly asked him to be on the lookout for anyone willing to sell a young girl with very light skin between the ages of 6 and 17 for a sangoma. Captain Lombard never went into great detail about whether this was a direct assignment from the Navy man or something that came up in conversation. After the interview, Owen pointed them to a nearby property. Police staked out the location. It was empty. The neighbor, however, was there and he allowed authorities into the property and it was searched and no traces of Joshlin were found. Captain Lombard, by then it was around 8 p.m., left the team behind while he returned to the office. As cross-examination deepened, Advocate Fanny Harmser made a significant disclosure that reframed much of what occurred inside Sea Border on the 4th of March. Earlier in his testimony, Lombard had revealed to the court that following a day of uncooperative behavior, it was Jacquen Appollis and Steveno van Rhyn who had later that day told authorities that if they wanted to know what happened to Joshlin, they had to speak to a woman. Lombard, led by the state, never mentioned the woman by name. Under cross-examination by Advocate Harmser, the captain said his decision to omit the woman's name was not motivated by anything. He just chose not to say her name. The judge added that it was interesting that the state had chose not to enter the woman's name into the record when they led Lombard's evidence in chief. It was during this part of Advocate Harmser's questioning that the woman in question was identified as Phumza Sigaqa. It was the first time in open court that Phumza's name was directly linked to those statements, not by police, but by the accused themselves. Lombard claimed that Steveno was the first to mention her when he said something like, open quote, "You must go speak to Phumza, she knows where Joshlin is," close quote. Steveno's claim was that Joshlin had been handed over to a woman named Phumza who then sold her to a sangoma. The narrative went something like this. Lourentia Lombaard lured Joshlin away. She passed her on to her boyfriend Ayanda. Ayanda then gave the child to his sister Phumza, who completed the transaction. When the police took that information and cross-referenced it with Jacquen, he confirmed it, reportedly in an attempt to avoid further intimidation, according to his lawyer. Captain Lombard acknowledged that Phumza's name surfacing during the interviews formed part of the justification for her subsequent arrest. That night, police raided her home, took her into custody, and began questioning her about her alleged involvement in child trafficking. She was interrogated on whether she was a sangoma and whether she had any link to Joshlin Smith. Now, this is a portion of the breakdown I want to spend some time on. Speculation has risen ever since Harmsa mentioned that Phumza is allegedly Ayanda's sister. Phumza was arrested in the middle of the night on Monday, the 4th of March 2024. She was accused of trafficking a 6-year-old girl, and then she was let go without explanation, without apology. Now she's back in the story, this time as witness 55 for the state. According to Phumza, in interviews she gave after the case was dropped against her, that night the police came just before midnight. It was 2 weeks since Joshlin had disappeared. She and her husband were asleep in their home in Middelburg, Deersville, when they were awakened by the sound of banging and police cutting through the shade net outside their home. Open quote, "They kicked down the door," close quote, she recalled. Open quote, "They asked if I was Lino's mom. I said yes. They took a picture of me. I asked why. They told me not to ask questions," close quote. She said they ordered her to get her ID, then they confiscated all the household phones. Phumza, her husband, and their 2 children were loaded into separate vans. She was taken to a white building in the Sea Border Unit compound, the same place where Kelly had been held for questioning. When she arrived, Phumza saw Kelly Smith at the facility. She was taken into a boardroom and questioned. The officers told her point blank, open quote, "Kelly and the other accused say they gave the child to you," close quote. They asked her if she was a sangoma. They asked what she had done with Joshlin. They expected a confession, but she had nothing to offer. Phumza denied knowing anything. She said the last time she saw Joshlin was the day the child disappeared. She walked past her house with Kelly. Later that day, Kelly came back and asked if she'd seen Joshlin. That was it. She was charged at the Hopefield police station, appeared in court twice, and was held at Langebaan police station for 7 days. When she returned to court on the 13th of March, the charges were withdrawn. The legal system let her go, but it didn't let her move on. Phumza says she still carries the weight of that night, emotionally, professionally, and in her community. Her fingerprints were taken. She fears now they appear in criminal background checks. She lost a job opportunity after a potential employer conducted a clearance check. She says her children were teased at school, called gang names like, quote-unquote, Nongoloza, a Zulu word that refers to a criminal, and ridiculed by neighbors. After fleeing for months out of fear, she returned to Deersville despite police advising her to relocate. She says at some point the community supported her and she was not willing to be driven out by a mistake that was not hers. Open quote, "My life is stuck. It feels like it just happened yesterday," close quote, she told reporters shortly after the charges were withdrawn. In court, her name resurfaced during the cross-examination of Captain Lombard. Advocate Fanny Harmsa, representing Jacquen Appollis, pressed the captain. Was he aware that Phumza Sigaqa is allegedly Ayanda's sister? Lombard's answer was ambiguous. Open quote, "There is no evidence of that. None of our investigations suggest that she and Ayanda are related," close quote. The word quote-unquote allegedly became a fulcrum. Harmsa didn't present proof. He didn't call it fact. But he opened the door to speculation that has long simmered online and in the community. The idea that Lourentia lured Joshlin to Ayanda and that Ayanda passed the child to his quote-unquote sister Phumza, who then handed her over to a sangoma, has circulated since early in the case. Now, court testimony confirms that Phumza was the woman named by the accused during their questioning at Sea Border, and the state has confirmed she's now witness 55. She will testify. But many questions remain unanswered. Why were charges dropped if her name came from 2 separate suspects? Why hasn't the state confirmed or denied her connection to Ayanda beyond Lombard's investigative findings? Will Phumza's testimony support the case or reveal something they haven't accounted for? Her story is no longer just background. It's on the record and it's in the courtroom, and when she takes the stand, the trial may take a turn no one expects. Lombard stood by the process. He told the court the suspects were not mistreated and that their statements were taken in accordance with the law. The defense offered a sharply different account of what occurred at Sea Border. They argued that the suspects had been illegally detained, deprived of legal counsel, and physically and psychologically abused until they cooperated with police demands. Harmsa described the so-called quote-unquote helicopter torture method, a technique in which suspects are handcuffed with their arms looped over their knees. A metal rod is passed through the gap and they are lifted off the ground. He alleged that while suspended in this position, Jacquen was suffocated with a plastic bag and slapped across the face by a Xhosa-speaking officer while a colored officer stood by. When Lombard was asked whether such an incident could have taken place without his knowledge, he replied that he had been in and out of the rooms and had not witnessed anything resembling torture. He denied ever using violence or threats and maintained that the environment was controlled. Advocate Jacquen and Steveno's lawyer, raised the matter of how her client was brought to the compound. According to the defense, Steveno had been hitchhiking home from Fredericksburg Court when he was picked up by strangers in a white double-cab bakkie. He was then allegedly transferred to a second vehicle and delivered to Seaborder without explanation. He was never told he was under arrest and his rights were never read. Lombard stated under oath that he was not part of Steveno's apprehension and did not know the full details of his transportation. However, he emphasized that once Steveno arrived at Seaborder, no signs of physical abuse were observed and that the man was responsive and alert. The heart of the dispute lies in what happened during the time Lombard wasn't in the room. The defense insists that the statements obtained from Jacquen and Steveno were the product of coercion, made only after abuse, fear, and exhaustion wore them down. Lombard stood firm. He did not witness any form of assault. No one reported mistreatment to him, and the procedure followed was, in his view, in accordance with operational standards. But as the trial within a trial continues, the court must determine whether the statements taken that day at Seaborder were voluntary or whether they were extracted under duress behind closed doors during the hours Lombard couldn't account for. That answer may decide whether those statements ever reached the record in the main trial. By the evening of the 5th of March, after 2 days of interviews, tension, and cross-referencing stories, Captain Lombard gave the order. All three, Kelly, Jacquen, and Steveno, would be charged. As the trial within the trial reaches its climactic point, which should be towards the tail end of next week, it's up to the judge to decide, were those statements voluntary and will they be allowed into the main trial? By the time week 4 opened on Monday, the 24th of March 2024, Lourentia Lombaard had already spent days under intense cross-examination. She was the state's Section 204 witness, granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for her full cooperation, but that immunity came with a cost. Her every word was under scrutiny. What followed in her final days on the stand was a systematic dissection of her two confessions, the first made just after her arrest in March 2024 and the second given under immunity in October. Under questioning by advocate Fania Harmser for Jacquen Appollis and advocate Jacquen for Steveno van Rhyn, Lombard was forced to confront the inconsistencies between her two statements. The contradictions were no longer subtle. In March and October, she claimed she heard Kelly discussing a 20,000 Rand transaction to sell Joshlin. Under cross-examination, she admitted she never actually saw the amount. She simply heard Kelly and Jacquen talk about it. In March, she said Jacquen was present at the handover to the white polo that Monday Joshlin disappeared. In October, she excluded him entirely. Her October statements added new details that were absent from her initial confession. A window being smashed by Kelly during a heated argument with Jacquen the day before Joshlin's disappearance, witnessing Kelly pack Joshlin's clothes in a black cooler bag before she left for work that Monday morning, and the alleged buyer wanting Joshlin for her light eyes and complexion. Advocate Harmser grilled her on why these critical elements only appeared months later. Lombard's answer remained the same. Open quote, "I was afraid when I made the first statement. I didn't trust the officer. I was withdrawing. I wasn't thinking clearly," close quote. But Harmser wasn't satisfied. He pointed to the fact that even under the October statement, Lombard contradicted herself while testifying, changing her version yet again while under oath. Judge Nathan Erasmus intervened repeatedly to clarify timeline errors and highlight inconsistencies. He questioned why, if Lombard believed she had told the truth in October, she still found herself altering that version during testimony. He also pressed on her apparent omission of important facts in both statements. Open quote, "Why were certain key details never mentioned, even when you were under protection?" Close quote. Lombard again cited fear, confusion, and emotional distress. At one point, she broke down in tears. The court was adjourned. She returned composed, but visibly affected. On day 17, the court began to shift its focus. Judge Erasmus announced that the trial would now enter a trial within a trial, a legal mechanism to determine whether certain statements made by the accused were admissible as evidence. The moment the court moved into this phase, Lourentia Lombard's testimony was set aside. She had laid the groundwork for the state's version of what happened to Joshlin, but now the court is at a point where it has to decide whether the evidence used to charge the other accused had been obtained lawfully or by force. As proceedings wound down for the week, Judge Erasmus addressed a procedural matter that could have stalled momentum in the ongoing trial. The Western Cape High Court was officially scheduled to go into recess for 2 weeks, a standard break in the court calendar used to accommodate administrative duties, judicial preparation, and time for parties to consolidate ongoing matters. But this trial isn't standard, and neither is the public interest surrounding it. To avoid disruption, a compromise was reached. Judge Erasmus announced that court would not adjourn for the full recess, but instead only observe a single day off, Monday the 31st of March 2025. The judge explained that this short break would allow counsel, witnesses, and all court participants to, in his words, quote-unquote, sort out their lives before resuming the trial within a trial on Tuesday, the 1st of April 2025. When the trial resumes, Advocate Nobahle Mkabayi is expected to complete her cross-examination of Captain Wesley Lombard, the officer whose testimony has thus far stood at the center of the state's defense of its procedures on the 4th and 5th of March 2024. Notably, while Kelly Smith's legal representative has not taken part in this procedural hearing, since his client was not one of the accused who made contested statements, he is expected to cross-examine Captain Lombard during the main trial, when the broader facts of the case return to the center stage. His line of questioning will likely test Lombard's broader role in the investigation and how it may implicate or exonerate Kelly Smith. Beyond that, new witnesses may soon take the stand. One of them could be Captain Muller, a law enforcement officer expected to assist the court in interpreting visual evidence, including images, maps, or footage collected during the investigation. His testimony is anticipated to help the court understand the spatial and contextual layout of key sites, possibly tying the physical evidence more directly to the narrative the state has been constructing. As for Phumza Sigaqa, now confirmed as witness 55, the timeline for her appearance remains unclear. She's expected to testify, but when and under what line of questioning has not yet been made known. For now, all eyes remain on the courtroom. This brings us to the end of our breakdown. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. Also, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think about the state's case so far? Do you believe the case against Kelly has at this point presented lower prospects for her defense? Drop those comments below and I will send personal shoutouts in the next breakdown. Lastly, if you're looking for the best explainers on everything important happening around you, visit our news website, swisherpost.co.za. No agenda, just the story.